So, welcome everyone. My name is Cameron Soltis, and on behalf of the Alden Peel Humanist Community and Cafe Scientifique Mississauga, I am proud to announce that tonight we have a guest speaker, Dr. Joe Schwarcz, the director of the McGill Office of Science and Society. Professor Schwarcz has received numerous awards for teaching chemistry and for interpreting science for the public, and he was the first non-American ever to win the American Chemical Society's prestigious Grady Stack Award for demystifying chemistry. He was also awarded the 2010 Montreal Medal, which is the Canadian Chemical Institute's premier prize recognizing lifelong contributions to chemistry in Canada. Professor Schwarcz hosts the Dr. Joe Show on Montreal's CJAD and has appeared hundreds of times on the Discovery Channel, CTV, CBC, TV Ontario, and Global Television. He has also authored 18 books, the most recent being A Grain of Salt, which separates fact from fiction in the realm of food and food chemistry. Tonight, Dr. Schwarcz will be giving us his talk on aging, fact and fancy, diving into what science says about aging and growing old. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Schwarcz. And then please mute your audios.
Thank you very much. Let me start by telling you a little story about a gentleman who had a problem with his wife because she suspected that he was fooling around, but he wasn't. And every night he would come home, she would inspect him to see if there were any loose hairs or pieces of lint. And he got really tired of this. So he decided he was really going to fix her. And he got himself a lint brush and he made sure before going home that he didn't have a single piece of lint, not a single piece of hair on his clothing. So he goes home, she looks at him, and she gets angry, more angry than ever, and says, "What's the matter now?" Says, "And now you're running around with bald women." Well, the point of this little story is that she had made the right observation, but came to the wrong conclusion. And science is all about making observations and coming to conclusions. And that is what we deal with through my office at McGill. We try to shine light into the dark crevices of the world of pseudoscience. And we are tasked to separate sense from nonsense. And we do this without any conflict of interest because we do not accept any money from any sort of vested source. Our only allegiance is to the scientific method. All right, well, let's get down to the topic at hand, aging. We're all doing it, that's for sure. And it is somewhat disturbing because when you think about it, every minute that passes brings us 1 minute closer to the end, which is not a very, very attractive prospect. Well, it was Robert Browning, the great English poet, who said, "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be." So said Robert Browning, who I think must have been clowning. Because let's face it, old age is not so great. Those golden years are kind of rusty. And it isn't so pleasing to see all of those candles light up. There are all kinds of concerns that we have about growing old. Some of them are pretty disturbing. Nobody likes this kind of a prospect. And nobody likes to have to contend with this kind of situation. But luckily here, science comes to the fore because we've got solutions for that problem, although not everyone is overjoyed with having that particular solution. So there are many interesting things that we can talk about when it comes to aging. And we know that eventually our body is going to wear out, right? We don't know when, but we know that our lifespan is limited. Some people are lucky. They can do everything wrong and live to a ripe old age, whereas others meet their end at a very early time. Life isn't always fair. But wouldn't it be great if we could turn back that clock, if there really were a fountain of youth, that you would go in and come out decades younger? Is there such a thing? Well, there is. If you go to Florida, if you go to St. Augustine, Florida, you can actually find the Fountain of Youth. There it is. You can go and bathe in the water, even drink the water. Historically, this goes back to the time of Ponce de Leon, who supposedly turned old men into spring chickens. Interesting that you would find the Fountain of Youth in Florida. There doesn't seem to be much evidence for it working there. But in any case, there it is. And the story is that Ponce de Leon, an explorer, Spanish explorer, came to Florida searching for the Fountain of Youth and found it. Well, of course, it's a nice story, but it is just nonsense. There is no Fountain of Youth there. The only thing we know of Ponce de Leon is that he didn't age very well because his life ended in a conflict with the natives in Florida. But if anyone is willing to go to Florida, and you have to be brave to go there these days, it's a hotbed of COVID, you can go and try the Fountain of Youth and see what that water really tastes like and what it does for you. But of course, there's no science here. This is a myth, but it's an interesting one. Over the years, historically, there have been a large number of supposed anti-aging regimens. If we go back to the Bible, time of King David, when he got older and became full of rheumatism and all the symptoms of old age, and he went to his doctors and asked, "What should I do?" And they gave him good advice. They said, "Go and lie with young women." And he did. It's in the Bible. You can check it out. And apparently, it worked for him. These days, I think you'd have a hard time getting a doctor to give that particular prescription to an elderly gentleman. The ancient Romans had a similar belief. They thought that the Vestal virgins were the very picture of youth and that their exhaled breath was rejuvenating. So they would stay overnight in a room with not much air circulation, and in the morning, the elderly gentleman would come in and inhale the exhaled breath of these young ladies and claim that they felt much better and felt younger. Cleopatra had her own anti-aging regimen, bathing in donkey milk. Well, believe it or not, this is not total nonsense. I don't think it has to be donkey milk, but back in those days, of course, there was no refrigeration and milk would spoil. And when milk spoils, it forms lactic acid from lactose, which is the milk sugar. And lactic acid is the alpha hydroxy acid that you may have heard about that is used in some modern cosmetic products because it causes a faster turnover of the cells on the surface of the skin. Ge Hong in the 4th century in China recommended a medicine made from herbs and monkey brains. And this would lengthen life up to 500 years. Well, he did not live long enough to prove his point. So this was sort of monkey business. Elizabeth Báthory in Hungary in the 16th century. She didn't follow Cleopatra's modality exactly. She didn't bathe in sour milk. She bathed in the blood of young women. She actually had young women butchered and their blood drained. And some suggest that this is what gave rise to the stories about vampirism, which of course were set mostly in Transylvania. In the Middle Ages, attention focused on urine for aging. How does this work? What does this have to do with anything? How can urine be connected to aging? Hennig Brandt was a German alchemist, and he has become famous for the discovery that he made. He thought that urine was the key to life because of its color. It was a golden color. The alchemists knew that gold would not age. It never rusted like iron. It had some sort of magical anti-aging property. They looked at the color of urine and they thought that what was happening here was that people were born with a certain amount of gold in their body, but they slowly peed their life away, that they were losing the gold in their urine. So he decided to find out what this magic ingredient was. So he took a vat of urine and he boiled it and boiled it to see what the residue would be. And the sun went down, and there was no electricity in those days. And then he saw something amazing. That flask began to glow in the dark. He thought for sure he had discovered the secret of youth. Well, he had not, but he did make a very important discovery. He had discovered phosphorus, because urine contains phosphates, and when you boil it dry, the phosphate will be reduced to phosphorus. So that was a key discovery. And then Charles Hofland in the 18th century suggested that laughter was the healthy thing to do, but he had another possibility. He also suggested to sleep in the proximity of youth, bringing back the King David idea. But it was really Charles Brown-Séquard, French-American physiologist, who really laid the foundations to the scientific side of aging. And he was interested in the gonads of animals, particularly dog testes, because he had noticed that animals that were castrated started to develop all kinds of illnesses and aged very quickly. So he thought that there was something in there that had a rejuvenating property. He experimented with dog testes, with guinea pig testes, and he became his own guinea pig. He injected himself with the extract of these testes, and he claimed that he felt vigorous and rejuvenated. As you can imagine, when the media heard about this and hit the press, there were all kinds of stories. And then there were the charlatans who climbed on this bandwagon and started to sell extracts of animal organs based on Brown-Séquard's remedy. And Serge Voronoff was a disciple of Brown-Séquard, who had followed Séquard's work and thought that there might be something to this. He thought that maybe there is really something in the testes that has some sort of physiological effect. But he wanted to go one step further. He thought, why make an extract of the testes? Why not implant the whole testicle into the scrotum of aging men? But where were you to get such a specimen? He made a deal with the French government. He would get the testes from executed criminals. And that's how he began his research. And he implanted these into aging men. And surprisingly, there was no shortage of volunteers for this. And he found that it had an effect. But pretty soon, he ran out of testes. There were not enough people being executed. So he thought the next best thing would be to rely on man's closest relative, the great apes. And he started a farm in Italy where he raised chimps. And he harvested their testes and used these in his surgical procedures. And over 1,700 men had this surgery. And of course, they sang its praises. Whether it was the placebo effect or whether there actually may have been some residual testosterone in those testes is very, very hard to say. But he did achieve a degree of fame. Not everyone was happy with this. Obviously, the monkeys were not happy with this procedure. And neither was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle was a doctor, luckily not a very good one, because it was while he waited for the patients who never came that he had time to put pen to paper and write the Sherlock Holmes stories. And he was very much disturbed when he read medical reports about this business of testicular extract and testicular transplants. And he made fun of this in one of the best Sherlock Holmes short stories, The Adventure of the Creeping Man, where an aging professor of physiology falls in love with a young woman and has to rejuvenate himself and injects himself with monkey gland extract. And Holmes is called into the situation when the elderly man is found crawling around on his knuckles and his knees and climbing up walls because he had made a monkey of himself. Eugene Steineck was a medical doctor in Austria who had a different kind of idea, but in the same vein. He thought that if you could just tie off the duct that went from the testes to the body, you would force the testes to make more of whatever it was making, because if it wasn't delivering its contents, it would try to make more to force it out. That was his idea. And he was known as the Wizard of Youth and really achieved a fair degree of fame by carrying out this operation, which was actually a very simple surgical operation where he just tied off the seminal duct, basically performing a vasectomy. That's what it was all about. And he had evidence. First, he did it on dogs and showed the older dog that was then rejuvenated. And he also claimed that it worked for men. And here was an example he published in a medical journal where the gentleman was subjected to this ligature of the duct and said that he developed muscles, felt better, etc. And again, it was quite popular for a while. Sigmund Freud apparently had this procedure done because he also wanted to have basically affairs with younger women. In the United States, John Romulus Brinkley heard about all of this stuff, and he decided he better get it on the game because he saw that there was money to be made. But he wasn't a doctor, although he had taken some course from a diploma mill, but he hung out a shingle and he became the goat gland doctor. That's how he was known. Now, he had grown up on a farm, and he had seen the antics of goats, and he saw that they were quite horny and that they basically were a happy lot. So he thought, because he couldn't get his hands on human testes or chimpanzee testes, but goat testes would do. So he became indeed the goat gland transplant doctor, and he transplanted the testicle of a goat into men. Again, no shortage of customers for this. And no complications, because basically he never connected the testicle to anything. So there were no infections. One day he got a letter from one of his patients a year after he had done this transplant, thanking him because not only did he regain his vigor, he maintained, but he had also fathered a son. And the real neat little footnote to the story is the name that he gave to the son, which was Billy, supposedly after the goat who had donated the testicle. But he, as I said, he performed hundreds of such operations. And given the fact that, this was early days of surgery, he had remarkably few complications. And he had a lot of satisfied customers. Well, of course, today we do things somewhat differently. Don't transplant testicles, but the fact is that the testes do produce testosterone, which is the main male sex hormone. And it is used today, but of course it is only used when blood tests show that someone has low levels of testosterone, because the injection of testosterone is not without any risk. It is a hormone that causes things to grow, and it can also cause tumors to grow. So one has to be very careful about the use of testosterone. But it's interesting that all of this silliness that I just talked about really was the forerunner of modern hormonal therapy, not only for men. Today, of course, we use hormonal treatments for women as well in the form of estrogens. And up to the 1970s, this was a very, very popular treatment for women as soon as they reached menopause. It was almost automatic. that they would be started on a regimen of Premarin, which is the most popular. The name comes from pregnant mare's urine. That's where the estrogen is isolated from, because it is well known that at menopause, the levels of estrogen in a woman's blood start to drop. So it was an inviting notion that if you give supplements of estrogen, you can, in fact, do something about aging, and you can. It does have some very good properties. Again, you have to be very careful, because we know that estrogen also predisposes to breast cancer. And that's why today it is given with much greater care. It is not routinely done. But I think sometimes women are too scared of estrogen. And there are some women who go through terrible menopausal symptoms and do not want to take estrogen because of the very, very, very small risk of breast cancer. So it's always a question of weighing risks against benefits. There are many opponents, of course, of Premarin. They say, why would anyone want to take a medicine made from the urine of pregnant horses? Well, of course, this is not a question of injecting the urine of pregnant horses into people or making the pill directly from that. The estrogen is extracted, it is purified, and there's no vestige of horse urine in the finished product. Great excitement was caused when scientists first began to learn about human growth hormone, which is a hormone that is produced by the pituitary gland, which is a tiny pea-sized gland smack in the middle of our brain. And back in 1990, a classic study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, as you probably know, the New England Journal of Medicine is one of the most highly respected medical journals in the world, sort of the Bible of medicine. And Daniel Rudman, the lead author of this study, was a highly respected researcher. What they had done was to look at the effects of introducing growth hormone into aging men. Why would you do this? Because the production of growth hormone in people winds down as we get older, as one would expect, because you're not growing anymore, so you don't need this hormone. So the question was, might it have some anti-aging effect if you supplement it with growth hormone, if you increase the levels of this to what it was in youth? Not a totally scientifically bankrupt idea. So they enlisted about 18 volunteers and gave them human growth hormone, which in those days was extracted from the pituitary gland of cadavers. So it was very, very expensive. It cost about $17,000 for one 6-month regimen in this study. But there were some interesting results. This gentleman is in his 80s, and he said that he felt totally rejuvenated. His muscle structures changed. There was an increase in lean tissue. There was a decrease in fatty tissue, an increase in skin thickness. So it looked very good. Once again, of course, when the press heard about this, there were stories about the fountain of youth having been discovered. Well, it turned out that they stopped the study after about 6 months because they started to see some side effects. Some of the men developed carpal tunnel syndrome, and there were other side effects as well. And indeed, Rudman, the lead author, had to write a letter to the New England Journal saying that they had stopped the treatment after about 6 months because they had noted these kind of side effects. And he felt that he had to do this because the press had gone way overboard, touting his regimen as sort of the key to youth. Well, today, growth hormone is still around and it's still being researched. But back then, there were clinics that opened up based upon the Rudman study. Many of these were in Nevada, where there's very little legislation about such things. And people were charged quite a bit for the human growth hormone, but not enough so that it really was human growth hormone. Because in those days, it was very, very expensive. And of course, they couldn't charge $17,000 a person. They were charging much, much less. And who knows what they were injecting. But in those days, it really wasn't human growth hormone. Today, human growth hormone is actually available because you can make it through recombinant DNA technology, and it is used for certain conditions. But it certainly is not used, as it was back then, with clinics cropping up all over the place because the government clamped down on them. But you can't keep the charlatans down for very long. They always have a new idea. So here was a very clever idea that they came up with, the so-called growth hormone secretagogues. So what was this all about? Well, human growth hormone is a protein, which is a long chain of amino acids. And we know exactly which amino acids, how they are linked together, and what the relative ratio is. So what these secretagogues was a mixture of amino acids in the ratio that you find them in the protein. And the idea, of course, that they promoted was that when you take this supplement, you give your body raw materials for making this hormone, and the body will then churn it out. This is, of course, total nonsense. This is akin to taking some windows, some doors, and some bricks and piling them on an empty lot and waiting until they assemble themselves into a building. You will have a very long wait. Well, this is the same kind of an idea. The reason that we don't form growth hormone as we get older is not because of the lack of raw material. Goodness knows we eat enough protein in North America. There's no shortage of amino acids in our body. But the enzymes that are needed to make the growth hormone no longer function because the growth hormone is not needed by the body. But people, of course, bought into this idea because it was very cleverly advertised. And needless to say, there are those who will tell you that they feel much, much better when they take this. Of course, there are people who will tell you they feel much, much better when they take anything because of the placebo effect. 30 to 40% of the time, just taking something will have some sort of benefit. Well, today, human growth hormone, real human growth hormone is available. It's still very expensive. And but there are people who, of course, do have enough money to do this. And Sylvester Stallone is a big proponent of human growth hormone. Nick Nolte has done it, Suzanne Summers. And they all claim that they feel better. But there's a risk with taking human growth hormone because you don't know what else it is going to foster the growth of, such as incipient tumors in the body. Today, there's also a lot of talk about telomeres. What are they? Human chromosomes are basically just coils of DNA that are found in the nucleus of our cells. And as you know, this basically is the blueprint of life. In DNA is encoded the secret to making any protein in the body, including all the enzymes that we need. So there's no question that this is the essence of life is in the chromosomes. And the segments of DNA at the end of these chromosomes are what are referred to as telomeres. And the analogy that is usually given here is if you take a shoelace, the little plastic thing on the end of the shoelace that prevents it from unraveling, that's equivalent to the telomere. So that whenever a cell divides and the chromosomes divide and new chromosomes are formed, in order to prevent any accidents of them unraveling, the telomeres are protective. And I mean, this is legitimate science. There's no question about that. The telomeres exist, and there's been a lot of research on this. And in fact, the 2009 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was awarded to Elizabeth Blackburn, Carol Breitner, and Jack Szostak. Jack Szostak, incidentally, is a McGill graduate, and they received the Nobel Prize for unraveling the mystery of the telomeres. And of course, there's a lot of research now on how you keep the telomeres from being damaged, because if they get damaged, then they no longer can act as a protective coat on the chromosomes. And there's a lot of very serious research on that. But as you can imagine, the marketers get into this game. They hear telomere, they hear that it's somehow involved with aging. So all of a sudden, you start to have all kinds of products being promoted, such as this TA65, clinically proven to add length to your telomeres. Now, there may be some science behind that, as shown in the laboratory in a Petri dish. There are some interesting compounds in plants, and they use a plant extract here. It's some rare botanical that Astragalus membranaceus that does contain a compound that apparently in experiments in the laboratory in the Petri dish does have an effect on the telomeres. However, that is a long way from suggesting that it has any kind of anti-aging effect. It's an interesting compound and it needs further research. But what we really need is clinical evidence. You need to do studies in humans, various doses to see what it does. And nothing like that has happened. But as you may know, if you're going to sell something as a dietary supplement, not as a drug, you basically don't have to prove anything. You can sell anything. And of course, you can make claims in brochures and in books. You can't make the claim directly on the product, but you can make claims in a brochure that is, on the shelf beside the product. And that unfortunately happens. But the government doesn't look at that very favorably. And neither do some consumers who feel that they are cheated. So there have been a number of lawsuits already launched against the marketers of this particular product. And this is where it now stands. There just is no clinical evidence of efficacy. But the notion is not a scientifically bankrupt one, that we may eventually find something that does prevent the chromosomes from unraveling by somehow strengthening the telomeres. All right, let's take a little trip to Easter Island, which is off the coast of Chile. And some interesting research has been done here because the natives there were always barefoot. And it turned out that they never got any tetanus infections. No matter what, they got blisters and cuts on their feet, but there was never any tetanus. Researchers were intrigued by this, so they looked at the soil to see that maybe this was an area where, for some reason, the bacteria that caused tetanus were absent, which actually turns out to be so. But when they were looking at the soil, they did find another organism, another bacterium, that they found very, very interesting, because this particular bacterium eventually was found to contain a compound called Serolimus, and it had various effects on the immune system. And this is one that received a great deal of attention and a lot of research, because when cells are processing their nutrients and they're growing, there are a lot of chemical reactions that are going on. And some of these produce these notorious free radicals, which are linked to aging. And it turns out that this product, Serolimus, has a decided effect on these free radicals. So there really might be something to this in terms of anti-aging, and there's a lot of research that is going on now about Rapamune. Then we come to red wine. And of course, there are all kinds of stories about this, a glass of red wine a day, and this is supposed to be beneficial. What is in there? Well, the compound that has received a great deal of attention is this one here called Resveratrol. And indeed, it is found in red wine, and it is an interesting compound. Dr. David Sinclair is a researcher at Harvard, one of the top anti-aging researchers really in the world. He has published a great deal about his work on resveratrol and resveratrol analogs. And he got a great deal of attention when he carried out this study on mice, where he took 3 groups of mice, Some of them got just the ordinary diet. Some of them got a diet high in calories, so they would get fat. And the third group got a diet high in calories, but also supplemented with resveratrol. Well, it turned out that the high-calorie mice got fat, as you'd expect, except the ones that also got resveratrol did not have any of the aging effects that the other fat mice had. There were no deposits in their arteries. They were just as frisky as before. In fact, they were as youthful as the thin mice. So once again, the press got a hold of this, and all of a sudden, resveratrol was the key to aging. But what was left out of those press reports was that the amount of resveratrol that was given to these mice was the equivalent of 100 bottles of red wine. So if we are going to reap the benefits of resveratrol, and in the future we may actually do that, it is going to come from resveratrol supplements, not from drinking the wine, because there just isn't enough of it in there. But we have a scientific explanation, actually, for why this may work, because resveratrol is a compound that increases the formation in the body of a set of proteins called the sirtuins. And these are responsible for DNA repair. Now, every time that a cell divides, there's always a chance that some of the DNA is going to somehow make a mistake, so that when it gets copied, one nucleotide may be replaced by another, and this is what is called a mutation. I mean, this is what you hear so much about now, not in this context, but with the COVID virus, of course. Every time that virus replicates, there's always a chance of an error, and that's how you get the mutations. So anyway, resveratrol makes sense as an anti-aging product, because if you can somehow increase these sirtuins that will repair DNA, that of course is a good thing. And resveratrol supplements are around. You can buy them in the store. The trouble is that it's actually very difficult to keep resveratrol stable. It is a very, very labile compound. It is much easier to market these two substances, the NMN and nicotinamide riboside. These are so-called coenzymes. Now, when the body makes these sirtuins, there's an enzyme that is needed in order to make that. And for those enzymes to function properly, they need what are coenzymes, which are these substances. So again, there's a lot of research here, and this is not nonsense. Of course, it's not yet at a stage where one can make conclusive comments about this, but it does make sense. This whole idea that resveratrol increases sirtuins, that sirtuins have an anti-aging effect. You can also increase sirtuins by using these supplements. This is a very interesting area of research that needs to be fostered, and it is being fostered. But there is a simpler way to increase sirtuins, and that is just by restricting the amount of food that you eat. And this is something that has been shown over and over again in all kinds of species, starting from fruit flies to rats to monkeys. If you restrict their diet, they will live longer. Of course, this is not a very attractive proposition for humans, because you don't want to lead a life where you're constantly hungry. But back in 1935, we got some insight into this with Clive McKay, who was really the first one to notice that when mice were fed a diet with a significant reduced caloric content, they were more vigorous, they lived longer. They basically defied the aging process. Dr. Roy Walford, a California physician, pursued this and showed it very clearly that mice that were fattened up had a very different life expectancy than the mice that were put on a rigorous low-calorie diet. The low-calorie diet mice lived the equivalent of a human 20 years longer. So that's very, very, very significant. And Walford himself pursued such a diet and wrote a book called The 120-Year Diet. He said he would live to 120. Unfortunately, he didn't. He developed Alzheimer's, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and he died in his 70s. But he was pursuing this very, very low-calorie diet. And he was one of the scientists who was involved in this biosphere experiment in Tucson, in Arizona, where they lived in this gigantic bubble, totally separated from the outside world, in an experiment to see what would happen if eventually we had a settlement on Mars. Could this work? So it was a very interesting experiment. Unfortunately, he did not get the chance to really determine what the diet would do, because he contracted ALS, which had nothing to do with his diet. It was unfortunate. So anyway, calorie restriction is the only strategy known to extend life consistently in a variety of animal species. And there are, of course, human organizations as well. They, for example, the Calorie Restriction Society, and that's what they do. They eat about 30% less than what most people eat. But so far with people, we don't have the scientific evidence that they live longer. But that's just not enough time has passed since these organizations, started to practice this business. But we sure have some intriguing data with animals. If you look at these two rhesus monkeys, it is very clear that there's a decided difference. One is frail, moves more slowly, whereas the other one, who's been on a low-calorie diet, is vigorous and looks much healthier. One way that you can sort of easily cut down on calorie intake is by going on what is called a modified fast. And the one that people have the most success with is eating only during an 8-hour period. Doesn't matter how you select those 8 hours, but you just determine not to eat anything outside of those 8 hours. Because for many people, it's the nighttime snacking that gets you. That's when the pounds start to pile up. So here's an interesting way that one can expect to lengthen one's life just by eating less. Of course, then you have to address the question, what's the point of living longer if you have to give up the pleasures that it is worthwhile living longer for, right? Now, there are, of course, some far-fetched schemes as well. For example, you probably have heard of apoacrine, although you may not recognize it as such. This is this calcium-binding protein found in jellyfish. You may have heard about it because of a product that is being sold, being promoted that it comes from jellyfish, that it contains this aquaporin, and they give you this scientific sounding lingo about how wonderful this thing is, how it can reduce the damage of aging. And some of you may recognize that this is what we're talking about. Prevagen is wildly advertised on radio and on TV, even though they have been sued many times for false advertising. They just pay the fines and keep on advertising. The fact is that apoacrine may have some effects in the petri dish, but it gets degraded in the digestive tract, so it would not do anything. And furthermore, it isn't even extracted from jellyfish. It's true that it's found in jellyfish, but that's not where they get the pharmaceutical version. And there's absolutely no evidence that it works. And yet sales of this thing boom, because it just shows you that advertising works. Then there are some regimens that are totally absurd, like cryonics. Here, the idea is that you freeze someone just the moment after they have died and keep them frozen, hoping that sometime in the future, science will have progressed enough that they can be, quote, reanimated. The promoters of this technology never use the word death. People don't die. They just become deanimated, and they become reanimated in the future. And the notion is that at the moment of death, they are immersed in liquid nitrogen. Their blood is replaced by antifreeze. They are wrapped up, they're frozen, and it's quite a procedure in order to draw the blood and replace it with antifreeze. And then they are stored in these containers at the Alcor site, which is in Texas. And it's an expensive procedure. It's $100,000 to do this. And surprisingly, they want the money up front. They're not willing to wait until reanimation occurs. Now, notice also that there are some small containers. Why? Because those contain only heads. The idea here is that if science has progressed to the extent that you can bring people back to life, you can also clone the body from cells. So you don't need the whole body. It's enough to just keep the head. Sitting inside one of these canisters, believe it or not, is the head of Ted Williams, one of the greatest baseball players ever. His children decided to do this. So they had him decapitated and had his head frozen. And there it sits. And I think it's going to be a long wait until anything happens there. But finally, there is something that you can do in terms of diet besides just not eating. There's a lot of research on diets, of course, because we are what we eat. Obviously, food is the only raw material that ever goes into our body. So everything that happens in our body is somehow a function of the food that we eat. There are some foods that are hyped as superfoods. Well, the fact is, there's no such thing as a superfood. There are good diets and there are poor diets. Well, tell you where the notion comes from. Blueberries, for example. They are interesting because they are very nutritious and they are high in a set of compounds called polyphenols, which have antioxidant activity. And there's something to that because, of course, free radicals, which are formed in the body and can be neutralized by antioxidants, are notorious for diseases, aging, etc. Now, Tufts University in the US, they have done some pretty interesting testing with blueberries, discovered that they have a high antioxidant content, and that's because of these anthocyanins. These are the polyphenols that are responsible actually for the blue color. And pretty neat research. The original research was done with mice and with rats, and they're very, very good creatures for doing such research because they love blueberries. They will eat as many as you give them. Well, it turns out that as rodents age, there is a loss of activity of neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that connect nerve cells. And that is linked to aging. And with blueberries, they become more responsive to these neurotransmitters. Now, that has actual physical effects because it turns out that as mice and rats get older, they lose the ability to balance. Now, generally, these creatures are very adept at running across narrow ledges, running across ropes, etc. But by 19 months of age, things start to change. And they can't stay on the ledge as long as they used to. That's one of the consequences of rat aging. Well, it turns out you dope them up on blueberries, and then they can increase the time again that they can stay on this balance bar. That's pretty interesting. So that if you see your rats in your basement running cleverly across your clothesline, you know that you have a nice young population. But if you see them floundering and falling off the rope, you better get out the blueberries and give it to them. Of course, the fact is that human life is kind of like walking on a tightrope. We know that eventually we're going to fall off. We don't know when. But if blueberries help us stay on there longer, so be it. But obviously, this is not a question of once in a while eating them. And it doesn't have to be blueberries. All berries, basically all fruits, are beneficial. They all contain antioxidants. And the more of these we eat, the better. And you don't have to load up on these, but if you can squeeze berries and other fruits into your system on a daily basis, 5 to 7 servings, we have enough scientific evidence to suggest that this really does increase your prospects for longevity. But there is no superfood. So I don't want to tell you that blueberries are, something exotic and that they're akin to a drug. No, there are good diets and poor diets, but good diets will feature a lot of berries and a lot of fruits. We have some corroborative evidence for this from epidemiological studies. If we go to Japan, for example, the island of Okinawa, which has the largest number of centenarians in the world, people above the age of 100, and they really have impressive longevity. The question is, why? What are they doing? Well, this has been studied, and obviously attention is focused on the diet of these people. And it turns out that they consume virtually no red meat. They consume very little dairy products. They don't consume any refined grains. There's a lot of seafood, lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, and their protein sources is mostly from the sea. But of course, it's a bit too seductive to come to a conclusion that this is because of the diet, because they also have a very different lifestyle than we have. And of course, they have a different genetic makeup. But finally, there is one proven modality that is guaranteed to increase longevity. Unfortunately, you can't put it into a bottle. You can't sell it because it's exercise. And it doesn't have to be vigorous exercise. It can be bodybuilding. It can be just walking. A half-hour walk a day is probably the best thing anyone can do to increase longevity. Studies are showing that it is as good as jogging. Now, you don't want to be sauntering along. You want to be going at a good clip. But this is the best thing that we can do. That's how you stretch out your years, by doing exercise. Half an hour a day is really the best prescription that I can give you. But people are looking for miracles, of course. They don't want to do the work. They want that pill. Unfortunately, we don't have it. But there's a lot of scientific research, as I told you, about telomeres, about human growth hormone, about rapamycin. And some of this eventually will pay off, and it may have some importance. But to turn back the clock to the extent that we can get rid of all of those wrinkles and erase them all and relive our life, I don't think that's going to happen, not in our lifetime. But let me just finish off by focusing on the human lifespan, which is not the life expectancy. Life expectancy is what the average person can expect to live, right? Which is, around 80 in North America. Lifespan is the maximum number of years that any member of a species has ever lived. And for humans, it is defined by Madame Jean Calment, a French lady who lived to the age of 122 with a proper birth certificate. So we know that this really happened. And she was born in the 1800s. She knew Vincent van Gogh personally, not a nice man, she said. And she aged very nicely, very gracefully. At the age of 115, she said she would give up smoking because she wanted to live a long time. And she did, and she lived another 7 years. And at the age of 121, she made a recording of her life, an interview with a reporter. And that in itself is quite fascinating when you think about it, that she was born at a time when there was no sound recording at all. So she went through it all. She went through the early Edison cylinders, then the Edison records, then the 45s, then the 78s, then the audio tapes, then the 8-tracks, then the compact discs, and well into modern days with wireless transmission. So it's really quite amazing because it also shows you how much has happened in just during her lifetime. Anyway, during this interview, she answered many questions from the reporter. She was asked about what she really thought was important in life. She said, well, have sex as often as you can. And when the reporter said, how often is that? She said, I can't remember. She also said that she'd like to have a glass of wine every day. And she ate chocolates as well. 1 kilo of chocolates a week, she said. Not a day, don't get so excited, a week, which is still quite a bit. And obviously the press loved that idea. If chocolates are the key to longevity, and all of a sudden there were articles about how chocolates can save your life, which of course was nonsense. I suspect that the real secret here was that Madame Calment was blessed with great genes. So you've got to select your parents properly if you want to live a long time. I've been talking about this kind of business for a while because this search for the fountain of youth has always interested me. And so I keep up to date with the literature. And just recently, I got this ad about some youth restorative secret that may actually make you young again. I don't know what it is, but just to be on the safe side, I sent for it. So that next time I speak to you, maybe I'll look like that. Although I don't think I'm going to count on it delivering any real magic. So thanks a lot for your attention. I hope I've given you a few things here to think about. I don't think we have solved the problem of aging, but you know that there are people who are indeed working on it.
Thank you, Dr.
You can always go to our website. We have a lot of information there about all kinds of things. Thousands of articles, literally thousands of articles covering everything from cosmetics to nutrition to drugs, history of science. And we also have a weekly newsletter that we produce for free, of course. And you can go to our website and sign up for that, and you get it every Saturday morning. And it's, I think, an interesting mixture of information and entertainment. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schwarcz.
We can try to handle them.
Thank you, Dr. Schwarcz.
People can unmute if they want to share the applause, but yes, any questions?
Chuck O'Dell has one. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can. Hello, Chuck.
Yeah, okay. Regarding the diet restriction, you say arbitrarily say 20% increase. If you go less than starvation, can you get it to 10%? And vice versa, if you overindulge, will it go minus 10% or 20%?
Well, I think we have pretty good evidence that overindulgence will do that. Yeah, but the underindulgence, I mean, the studies that are done on the animals are all in the ballpark of 30% fewer calories than what they would normally eat, which is, for humans, it's pretty significant because, talking, if the average daily intake is, let's say, 2,000 calories, you're talking about taking away 600 calories. I mean, you feel that. But there are the people who are in these calorie restriction societies, and there are hundreds and hundreds of these people, say that you get used to it, and that you just feel better, you feel more energetic, and that gives you the motivation to keep doing it. But it's not easy to live on that restricted diet because, let's face it, food tastes good.
Oh yeah, right? I couldn't do it.
and eating is one of the pleasures of life. So
thank you very much.
Okay.
I did put my hand up in the participant thing. I had it up when he was talking, so I don't know if I should just jump in now.
Yes,
go ahead.
Please do.
Okay, I'm interested in the reduced diet, not so much for myself, but as a concept. And proportionality was one of the questions I had, and you've sort of answered that. And the other is, does it make a difference, for example, if you have your allotted amount at one meal, or if you spread it out, or if you have your time basis to be only one day, or you're looking at the quantity of calories, say for 3 days, and how it's organized.
No, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think it makes any difference in the final effect. I think it may make a difference in the ease with which you can subscribe to that diet. I think that spacing it out makes it easier. Having more small meals makes it easier to abide by a low-calorie diet than squeezing all the food into one meal and then being hungry for the rest of the day.
I also, I love food. I love food. I love food from all over the world. I just love food. But you don't have to eat a lot, because the problem, we eat too much. You can have a little bit of many things and it's fine. It's the problem of eating too much. And no matter how much you eat, there will be the last bite. It'll be the end of the cake if you ate the whole cake. There'll be the last bite. So if you just take 1 or 2 bites and you say, well, this is the end, this is the last ones, and savor them. It's,
well, you need
this is what we stopped doing. We stopped savoring our foods.
Because you need self-discipline to do that, which many people don't have. But also, it's also knowing which foods are the ones that are the most problematic in calorie content. And it's mostly the processed foods. It's the junk stuff. It's the sugary stuff. And I've said many of my talks and that if there were one thing that we could do in North America that would have the greatest benefit on health, it would be to eliminate sugared soft drinks. Those are a huge contributor of calories to the diet. And I mean, the size of the soft drink bottles here and the serving sizes. I mean, Europe, they go for a bathtub, the cups of soft drink that get here. No, that is just a travesty. If you want to go one step further, the next one would be potato chips.
Oh, that's my downfall.
Yeah, I mean, if you would eliminate soft drinks and potato chips, you would have a good step up on obesity in North America.
Yeah.
John, I see you have a question.
Yes, I was wondering about sugars, whether I should, what type of sugar I should be using in my coffee. Could I use a glucose or something like that instead of?
Well, you can, whether you use sucrose or glucose or fructose, it really, calorie-wise, it doesn't matter. Essentially, sugar is sugar. And the same thing goes for honey or molasses or maple syrup. Sugar is sugar. But then if you then resort to artificial sweeteners, another issue crops up. It is not the safety. These things, have been tested now for 40 years, and there's really no health issue here. However, it also turns out that the artificial sweeteners do not do what they claim to do. That is to cut down on the overall calories in the diet. Now, exactly why that happens is a matter of some mystery, because it may have something to do with the fact that you have your coffee and you put the artificial sweetener in it, and you're so happy that you've done that instead of putting sugar in the coffee, that you then reward yourself and you'll have that piece of cake that you would not have had if you had put sugar into your coffee. And the fact is that cake may contain more more calories than the sugar would have been in your coffee.
Yeah,
And then there's also the issue of just getting used to eating sweet things. I mean, people like sweet things, and artificial sweeteners are sweet. So it just caters to your craving sweetness. And these are the explanations that have been offered for why it is that we just do not see people who are constantly using artificial sweeteners lose any weight compared to people who are using sugar. But of course, with sugar, there are other problems as well, besides just the weight gain. I mean, obviously, anyone who has diabetes has to be very, very careful with sugar. And sugar just has no nutritional redeeming quality other than that it tastes good. I mean, sugar is not a nutrient that we require. You can live without sugar. I mean, you can't live without glucose, but any starchy food will have glucose. We do not need sugar per se in our diet.
I wasn't so much worried about calories. I was just wondering about the effect on your liver as sucrose breaks down to fructose and
right.
glucose.
I mean, there are some studies that suggest that fructose is more problematic than sucrose or glucose, and so that's why some people resort to using glucose or dextrose as the sweetener. But it doesn't have the same kind of sweet taste, though, as sucrose has. So you're usually not satisfied with what you are getting. So I think the real answer is just eat less of the foods that contain a lot of sugar. I don't think you need to eliminate it all. I think, I never say never eat anything because, life is too short for that. Moderation really is where it's at. But when it comes to sugar, people have a difficult time moderating. And when you look at just how much sugar there is in a glass of soft drink, it's just astounding. I mean, when you show it to people, when you show them in terms of equivalent of a sugar cube, that can of Coke that they're drinking has about 15 sugar cubes in it, then they pay attention. Because otherwise you don't see it. It's dissolved in the liquid. It's just, it's like it isn't there.
Elka, I see you have another question.
Is there anyone who hasn't spoken who has something first? Okay.
I'm not seeing it, but feel
Okay.
free to put up your hand.
Okay, it's not so much a question, it was just an interesting observation for something. I was at a restaurant in Spain. It would happen to have been a Michelin restaurant, but they grew their own fruit and vegetables, and they insisted that I must have the strawberries for dessert. And the strawberries were tiny, tiny. They were the most luscious things I ever had. No seeds, and all just a gorgeous flesh. But what was interesting when it was, you don't get a hell of a lot, but it was a good portion. But what was interesting is that when they served it, they provided tiny forks, a tiny spoon, a little bigger spoon, and a little bigger spoon, and then a regular sized teaspoon. So I just presumed that people in the past have all wanted bigger spoons. So I looked at it and I thought, this is interesting. So I started with the fork. Now, and I was alone. I was alone at my table, and there were people at other tables. I travel alone, and so I took the fork and took one strawberry, and I put it in my mouth, and I knew what was happening, and I couldn't stop myself. My eyes were closing, and I was going, and I knew I was doing this. I said, okay, this is bad, but it was so good. So I put it down, and I enjoyed the strawberry, and I took another one, and each one was the same thing. I put it in my mouth, and I couldn't stop. And I'm in public, and I'm alone, and I couldn't stop myself. So it was just interesting that I had this response. It was interesting that they put out all the all the different cutlery, the different size cutlery. And it goes back to what I said about it's like the last piece. Whatever it is, there was the last strawberry at some point of this glorious experience. There was, the last strawberry. And if they'd given me 5 less, it would have been neither better nor worse. There would still be the last strawberry.
I know exactly what you're talking about, those little strawberries. You see them very rarely here. But
he has it there. He has a 30-day window.
Yeah. So I grew up in Hungary, and we had them there. We used to go picking them. Now it's a different species. I mean, this is not. It's not a small strawberry that would grow into a big one.
No. Yeah.
And it really has a remarkable.
It's intense. It's
flavor.
very intense. Yeah.
Not like these giant strawberries we get here, which are the size of an apple and taste nothing because they're mostly water.
It's cardboard. Yeah.
I guess I'll ask one of my questions then. So Dr. Schwarcz, obviously you do a lot of science outreach. You do talks like this for us. As I mentioned at the beginning, you have you've been on a number of television shows, etc. Do you have any advice on how to communicate science effectively?
Not something that I can give you in a sentence, but sure. I think visuals are very important. The story that, or the saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, that really is true. I mean, I could have done the talk that I did here today with you without using any pictures. It would not have had the same impact at all, and you would not remember it the same way. I think visuals are very important. I think it's also important to know your audience, know what their background is, and at what level you can speak. Keeping it as simple as possible is always a good advice. What you want to do when you're going to discuss a topic that you have some expertise in is think about what really are the most important points that you want to get across, and focus on those. Because one problem that we run into, and I see this with colleagues, with expert scientists who are asked to give talks on things, and when you're asked to give a talk on your own work, which you live and breathe, when you're in science, you live and breathe it 16 hours a day, and you don't realize how specific that nomenclature is to you. And when you are asked to speak to someone who is not familiar with the topic, you don't recognize that they don't know this vocabulary, they don't know these words, because to you it's an everyday thing. So you have to think about that, and to communicate science and prepare a talk for an audience is challenging, and you have to think it through. What is the message that you really want to get out? At what level do you want to get it out? And you don't want to overburden them with overwhelming amount of data, because then the message just gets lost. So I guess all I can say is that communicating science is really an area of science that is as specialized as is heart surgery or oncology, where you have to work at it, you have to think about it, and you have to deliver the goods in a proper fashion.
Oh, thank you for that.
And of course, a little bit of humor always works.
Yes.
Yes.
Francois, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go right ahead.
Okay, I had a question. Losing muscle mass is a problem as you get older. How does this reduced diet impact a reduction in muscle mass? Can you keep up muscle mass as you?
The fact is that you only need about 50 grams of protein a day in order to satisfy the needs of maintaining muscle. And 50 grams of protein is not a lot. It's very easy to fit that even into a 1,500 calorie diet. And the best way to prevent muscle mass is with exercise. Weight-bearing exercise is the key to preventing loss of muscle. But you don't need protein supplements unless you're an athlete who really is into muscle building, is into to racing. But for the average person, you don't have to worry because it's easy to get 50 grams of protein a day in a diet.
Cool, thanks.
All right.
Quick question from Chuck, if I may.
Sure.
Yeah, black coffee, Dr. Schwartz. So one way or the other versus aging.
Yeah, we keep hearing good things about coffee, which is satisfying because at least it's something that we're not told to cut out. The studies now are showing that 2 to 4 cups of coffee is certainly not detrimental. It may even be beneficial. I mean, you may have seen these allegations that reduces risk of Parkinson's disease. The evidence for that is kind of weak. But I think we should just be satisfied with observing that the science shows that there's no problem in drinking 2 to 4 cups of coffee a day. I don't think that there's enough evidence to start looking at it as if it were some sort of drug. Now, some people who have high blood pressure may react adversely to the caffeine, and of course, caffeine is a stimulant, so drinking coffee at night can be a problem. But I'm okay with drinking 2 to 4 cups of coffee a day, and if it does any good, it's an added bonus. But the fact that it gives you pleasure also is a good thing.
Oh, thank you.
Is there maybe one more question? Anyone desperate to get out? All right. Then I guess I'll ask one last one. So near the start of your talk, you gave a couple of examples of things like, Cleopatra bathing in milk and the testes surgeries being, at least looking similar to modern hormone replacement therapies. Do you think that those were, the people really had the evidence behind it, or did they just get lucky?
Well, I think with the using sour milk, it's certainly conceivable that you could see the evidence. I mean, you can see what happens to the skin. That's possible. Now with the testicle extract and transplants, there it's very difficult to separate out the placebo effect. Because in those kind of cases, you would expect a very strong placebo effect. Placebo is very interesting because somehow the more unusual and the more invasive a procedure is, the stronger the placebo effect. You think that if somehow you're being tortured, it has to have a better effect on you. I mean, studies have shown that giving a placebo rectally, that is a suppository, works better than giving it orally. Injecting a placebo works better than a suppository because it's more invasive. And certainly when someone is putting a monkey testicle into your scrotum, that's a pretty invasive thing. And you think to yourself, gee, if I've undergone this, it better be worthwhile. And as soon as you start thinking like that, the placebo effect kicks in. And when it comes to like feelings and how you're feeling, energetic or whatever, that's really amenable to a placebo effect.
All right. So I guess with that, we'll say thank you, Dr. Schwartz. And again, if everyone could give a round of applause.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. It's been wonderful. A lot more testicles than I was expecting, but I think that's all part of the fun. So yes, we really appreciate your time and sharing your vast knowledge with us.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz.
Thank you
very much.
Okay, bye.